For decades, policemen and women serving in Northern Ireland have done so at great personal risk. And they still do, despite the many huge advances since the peace process. So tonight's accidental release of the names of every serving officer is an astonishing mistake by the province's police force.
We operate in an environment at the moment where there's a severe threat to our colleagues from Northern Ireland related terrorism, and this is the last thing that anybody in the organisation wants to be hearing this evening.
This has been a breaking story tonight, so we will try to assess what the potential consequences are. Also on News at 10. Donald Trump is back on the campaign trail as his main rival, Ron DeSantis, sacks staff and revamps his flagging challenge. Downing Street insists it supports the Tory deputy chairman after he says asylum seekers should go back to France in words a lot less polite than that. From fridge to radiator, the frightening reality of the melting ice of the Antarctic, and we're told it's a lazy life for the urban fox, but not everyone agrees.
They're just obsessed with food. I think that is just the key thing. They don't really go for safety, but they're just obsessed with food, going in bins, stuff like that.
And do they persist or do they give up?
No, persist.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. Throughout the grim sectarian violence of Northern Ireland's troubles, the lives of police officers were routinely at risk. Even now, there is still a security threat from dissident Republican groups to the men and women, uniformed and civilian, who work for the police service of Northern Ireland. So its accidental release this afternoon of a huge tranche of names, ranks and serial numbers is alarming to say the least, and particularly frightening for those working in intelligence gathering and other sensitive roles. Tonight, the PSNI apologised to all colleagues for what it called the unacceptable breach. It could hardly do anything else. The Police Federation, the officers' union, said in the wrong hands, the information could do incalculable damage.
Every police officer in Northern Ireland is a potential target for terrorists. The shooting of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell earlier this year was just the latest in a series of attacks by dissident Republicans. Constable Ronan Kerr was killed after a bomb exploded under his car outside his home in 2011. Other officers have narrowly survived attempts on their lives. Most serving officers, particularly Catholic members of the PSNI, are discreet about their jobs, often keeping what they do for a living a secret. So to have thousands of names published online accidentally by their own force has led to a security crisis and a public apology.
I understand that will be of considerable concern to many of my colleagues and their families indeed at the moment. We operate in an environment at the moment where there's a severe threat to our colleagues from Northern Ireland related terrorism, and this is the last thing that anybody in the organisation wants to be hearing this evening. So I owe it to all of my colleagues to make sure that this is investigated thoroughly, and we've initiated that.
After receiving a Freedom of Information request, the force published a spreadsheet containing statistical information on the strength of the PSNI. However, a second tab in the document contained entries of more than 10,000 officers and staff members. It revealed their name, their rank and where they are based, but thankfully not their home addresses.
Our police officers hold their personal data and the fact that they're in the police because of the severe threat level in Northern Ireland very close to their heart. And some of our officers go to extraordinary lengths to protect their identity and the role that they perform for police in Northern Ireland. So when this news broke earlier this afternoon, you can understand that those officers are completely devastated by this. But not only is it the officers, their families as well.
It's little consolation it was human error rather than a cyber hack. The information was publicly available for up to 3 hours, but it will cause grave anxiety for many officers for weeks and months to come.
And Ian is here to talk about all this. Look, this is I mean, I suppose mistakes do happen, but this is a particularly shocking one. I imagine people are very rightly alarmed by it.
Yeah, I mean, one of my police contacts in Northern Ireland texted me a short time ago just using the phrase utterly disgraceful. These are men and women who already, on a daily basis, take great precautions over their personal security. They check under their cars every morning in case there's a bomb under there. They vary their route to work. So what more can they do, they'll be asking themselves? Well, some are so protective of their identities that they will be asking themselves this evening, do I need to seek a transfer to a new area? Do my family have to move house? Now, those are in a minority, and they won't be able to do that immediately. What they'll be hoping is that the PSNI can try to establish how far this information was spread, who got to see about it, and check to see if it did fall into the wrong hands. Because we know that the number of dissident Republicans is relatively small. But we have seen that they've carried out successfully attacks on the police. Some members have been killed, some have been maimed for life. And we've just seen that their activities will have to be closely monitored, even more closely than they are already, to make sure that they haven't got this kind of information and they can't act upon it to kill more people.
Okay, Ian, thank you very much indeed. Now, undeterred by his court appearance in Washington, in fact, probably bolstered by it, Donald Trump returned to the campaign trail tonight. He was laying into his fellow Republican challengers as much as President Biden. One of them, his main rival, Governor Ron DeSantis, sacked his campaign manager as he fails to make any inroads into Mr. Trump's lead in the Republican race.
Those prosecuting Donald Trump tried to issue a protective order that would ban him from speaking publicly about the latest charges he faces. But as we've come to know, Trump doesn't do silent.
I will talk about it, I will. They're not taking away my First Amendment right.
This was his first public appearance since he rejected the terms of that protective order. He unleashed with characteristic defiance, and the New Hampshire crowd lapped it up.
How can my corrupt political opponent, crooked Joe Biden, put me on trial during an election campaign that I'm winning by a lot, but forcing me nevertheless to spend time and money away from the campaign trail in order to fight bogus, made-up accusations and charges? That's what they're doing.
Trump's rivals in this primary race are now struggling to get a look in.
How are you doing?
His closest runner, Ron DeSantis, today sacked his campaign manager. This is now his third major reshuffle, trying to breathe some life back into his candidacy bid. But Trump has a huge lead in the polls across the US heading into those Republican primaries next year. In New Hampshire, he now has a 24 percentage point lead over DeSantis. It's an even wider gap in Iowa, where candidates will meet their first real test in the January caucus. And in South Carolina, Trump's support is again in the mid-40s, while DeSantis is stubbornly stuck at 17%. The only poll that matters, though, is next year's presidential election. Indications are Donald Trump and Joe Biden are still neck and neck. The US president was today in Arizona touting his party's climate credentials. Meanwhile, a fourth potential indictment against Donald Trump could be announced this week, also relating to alleged election interference. Security around the Fulton County Courthouse is tightening, barricades preparing for protest. But the former president embraces all of this.
Every time you get indicted, I like to check the polls because one more indictment that I think this election's over.
It is Trump against the establishment.
One more.
And Peter joins me. Well, Peter, you said it there. Trump against the establishment, although, of course, he has been president. So in one sense, he is the establishment. Look, Ron DeSantis sacking his campaign manager doesn't exactly speak of a man whose campaign is going well, does it?
Absolutely not, Tom. I mean, this is now a one-horse race. And actually some news just as we come on air tonight. Donald Trump has sent an email, a fundraising email to his supporters saying, all signs indicate that your favourite president, whose only offence is challenging the political ruling class, may be indicted yet again as an innocent man. He is, of course, referring to that potential fourth indictment from Fulton County, Georgia, where he's accused of electoral interference, phoning up a Georgia official, asking him if he could find him an extra 11,000 or so votes. Of course, Donald Trump denies any wrongdoing. But when we talk now, Tom, about potential fourth indictments, this is all starting to feel almost routine. And the important context here, of course, to stress is that until this year, no former president had ever been indicted even once. but Donald Trump's wearing them as a badge of honour. The more the indictments stack up, the more he sees it as paving his way back into the White House. Yes, it's having a financial impact in his campaigning, it's taking its toll, but the more he's indicted, the more the fundraising comes in thick and fast. He's seeing his supporters willing to back this brand Trump, this anti-establishment billionaire. And to that end, it's providing Donald Trump with the kind of political advertising that money simply can't buy.
OK, Peter, thank you very much indeed. Well, still on politics and back here, the pressure on asylum seekers to take up their places in the accommodation barge moored in Portland in Dorset doesn't seem to have made much difference. Only a handful more moved in today, despite some being warned that if they don't, they'll lose the right to any accommodation. The deputy chairman of the Conservative Party, Lee Anderson, made his own unique contribution to the debate, suggesting with the F word that we don't normally use on News at 10 that asylum seekers could expletive off back to France if they don't like it. They're not from France, of course. Anyway, never mind. A View, a Downing Street spokesperson, was happy to support. Harry is here to make sense of this. Look, probably there are people who watching this who may fully agree with Lee Anderson, but we don't normally see our political discourse discussed, certainly not complex issues like this, discussed in these terms. And yet Downing Street seems absolutely behind him tonight.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I think the government think there is some advantage politically to embracing Lee Anderson's comments. It's worth saying he's not in government, but he's deputy chair of the Conservative Party. He serves with Rishi Sunak's backing. And Downing Street backed those rather crude comments about asylum seekers today. There was plenty of criticism, as you might imagine. Refugee charities said the comments were dehumanising, inflammatory. The Lib Dems said that the government's response to Lee Anderson's comments was toe-curling. Interestingly, no condemnation from the Labour Party about his comments. Lee Anderson was on TV again tonight on GB News, where he also works as a presenter. He used another F word. He described the government as failing to tackle this issue of illegal migration. Now, Number 10 haven't said whether they back his latest analysis. A spokesperson said tonight that we always said there was no overnight fix to this issue. I think if you take a step back from this, clearly the Conservative Party are happy to embrace this rather harsh rhetoric. We saw Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, describe what's happening on the South Coast as an invasion. There is a political calculation, I think, that this is useful to them. One opinion poll out today, though, doesn't agree with that. From YouGov, it says that 80% of the public lack the confidence that the government will stop the boats as they have promised to. So, look, I think whilst Number 10 have embraced that F word Lee Anderson used yesterday, it's the F word he's used tonight, failure, that I think might be of more concern to them going forward. OK, Harry, thank you very much indeed. Now, it's been several hours and 13 days since the singer and songwriter Sinead O'Connor sadly died at her flat in London. Well, today her funeral was held in the Irish seaside town she had long called home, her refuge from the world for much of her life. The ceremony itself was private, as that life often was, but the display of affection on the streets of Bray, south of Dublin, was very warm and very public.
They came in their thousands to honour a woman who in life played so many parts, that of reluctant star, of outspoken campaigner, and in death was described at her funeral as a beloved daughter of Ireland. Unconventional to the end, a camper van decked out in rainbow flags of diversity led her cortege, that paused briefly for one final standing ovation amid the crowds outside her former home here. The seaside town of Bray on Ireland's east coast is where she found a sanctuary from the rigours of fame. Her friends Bob Geldof and Bono were among the many mourners paying tribute and sharing memories.
I think we're still finding out what Sinead meant to us as a country and as a town. I think her legacy is immense and we'll only really be discovering it in the weeks, months and years to come.
She stood for so many things, like social injustice, like across the whole world, women's rights, mental health issues, in adults and in children. And she stood out in Ireland. She's one of the greatest women to come from Ireland, in my eyes.
Famously ill at ease under the bright lights of fame, she was laid to rest in a private ceremony. The eulogy referred to the hardship and adversity she'd faced, but also her ability to share solace and joy. that will live on most memorably in the song that made her name. There were few voices so evocative, few women so prepared to bear their vulnerability. And none so uncompromising in their beliefs.
Fight the real enemy!
Even at such cost to her career. Sinead O'Connor played an outsized role in the making of modern Ireland, acknowledged by this tribute on an Irish hillside and by the Irish President Michael D. Higgins, who said she had a profound impact on people. Today, the Irish people and fans around the world said thank you for a life beyond compare. John Ray, News at 10.
Another burst of exceptionally warm European weather, this time in Portugal, has triggered 3 major wildfires. The biggest is in the southwest of the country. Portugal experienced its hottest day of the year yesterday, 46 degrees Celsius, 115 Fahrenheit. Thankfully, the fire is 50 miles from the resorts of the Algarve. Firefighters are desperately fighting to make sure it stays that way.
Flames on the fringes of one of Portugal's most popular tourist regions. High temperatures and strong winds have propelled wildfires into the Algarve. Only the work of more than 900 firefighters in blistering conditions has stopped them spreading further. In the daylight, little has been left unscathed.
Durante a noite, os trabalhos que foram executados.
Work carried out by firefighters and the civil defence overnight has stabilised the perimeter of the fire, but there are 2 critical points on both sides that require a lot of attention.
More than 1,400 people have been evacuated so far. The fires have crossed into the northern part of the Algarve, around 50 miles from the southern coastal resorts.
If it goes to south, there's a huge forest, let's say a huge forest park that can be affected, and that's something that they are trying to avoid. But obviously, there is a risk.
5 million Brits visit Portugal each year. This, their favourite region. Now, the peak time. The major tourist sites are currently safe, but with extreme heat alerts in place, putting these wildfires out is even more of a challenge. Sam Holder, News at 10.
In the millions of years before man-made climate change, Antarctic ice has acted as a kind of fridge. Its icy whiteness helps deflect the sun's rays and keep the Earth cool. But scientists say that thanks to global warming from burning fossil fuels, more of the ice is melting and turning into darker oceans or land, which, you guessed it, absorb and distribute more heat. From fridge to radiator, you might say. Martin is here to talk us through the science.
It's quite tricky, Tom, because historically there's not a huge amount of data, simply because Antarctica is so wild and so inhospitable. But what scientists do say is the events they're seeing now would have been unthinkable even 30 years ago. Now, a heatwave in March last year caused by a river of warm air working its way in from Australia saw temperatures 38.5 degrees above average. Put that in context, that's the equivalent of it being 46 degrees on Christmas Day in the UK. Now, fortunately, it was winter, so temperatures didn't rise above minus 10 degrees. Had it been in the summer, though, there could have been unprecedented ice melt. And talking of ice, at the next chart we're going to see, the lines show the fluctuating levels of sea ice here over the last 40 years. Now, last year was the lowest since records began. This year, which we can see with this red line here, looks set to be even lower. We're currently missing an area of sea ice around the size of Argentina, and that's vital habitat for emperor penguins. It's where they breed and feed, and there are fears they could in the future face extinction. Then you have ice shelves. Now, they naturally carve off to form icebergs, nothing usual about that, like this one, A81, which is the size of Greater London. But that appears to be happening more regularly, and all these are indicators, scientists say, of humans' impact.
These things are important. They are important for Antarctica, which is vulnerable to change, but they are also important globally. And so yes, they're another sign of just how much we need to change how much we are affecting the planet and reduce how much we affect the planet through fossil fuel burning.
So what could this mean away from the South Pole? Well, Antarctica accounts for 90% of the world's ice and 70% of the world's fresh water. In some places, get this, the ice is 4 kilometres thick. So any unnatural melting can lead to change in ocean currents, rising sea levels, and in the UK, an increased risk of coastal erosion, flooding, and storm surges. Finally, as Tom was alluding to at the very beginning, Antarctica is white. It sounds simple, but it reflects the heat away. The more that melts, the less rays are reflected and the warmer the planet becomes. Essentially, as you said, turning Antarctica from a refrigerator into a radiator, making it much harder for us to keep a lid on climate change.
Well, Martin, all this on the day that it's been confirmed that July was the hottest ever month since records began. Connected or coincidence?
Really tricky, Tom, with any singular event to say these things are connected because there are fluctuations naturally within the weather. But what's important to note is that all global weather is connected. So those fires we saw in Sam's report were made more likely as a result of the heat wave we saw in southern Europe. That heat wave is the reason we've had such a wet and miserable summer here in the UK. The key thing to take away from this, though, is trends, because what we're starting to see is the trends we're physically observing now back up the scientific predictive models of where they see climate change going. And that picture is a pretty bleak one, I'm afraid.
OK, Martin, thank you very much indeed. Now, the Staffordshire pub called the Crooked House that was destroyed by fire on Saturday has now been completely demolished against the wishes of the West Midlands Mayor. By the look of this video, the 18th century pub building has gone for good, but Mayor Andy Street says he wants it rebuilt brick by brick because of its cultural and historical importance. The pub burnt down 2 weeks after it was sold to a private developer. The greatest football league in the world kicks off in 3 days' time. As all football fans know, the big spending Premier League has a big new rival. But its chief executive insisted to us today that the Saudi Pro League is no threat, despite its big summer signings. Keen sports fans might note that a similar attitude by the established leaders of the golfing world didn't end so well.
Time for new scenes. Time to tear the script. So bring the noise.
Broadcast in almost 200 countries, this weekend the Premier League will kick off without some familiar names, snapped up by the Saudi Pro League. But the Premier League's chief executive doesn't think it's a problem.
21 players, I think, have been signed by Saudi Pro League sides. They also have to have a mix of their own homegrown talent and international players. So at the moment, I think the Premier League's really strong. It's able to sustain itself, whether it be through its own investments in its own homegrown players or international talent.
Since Cristiano Ronaldo got the ball rolling with a transfer from Manchester United to Al Nassr in January, others have followed. A steady stream of Premier League players have moved to the Saudi Pro League, including Jordan Henderson from Liverpool, Chelsea's N'Golo Kante and recent treble winner Riyad Mahrez from Manchester City, with clubs in the Saudi League spending £385 million this summer alone. While they've been making big signings, the Premier League has been investing in homegrown talent, like here at Brighton and Hove Albion's Elite Football Performance Centre. 13 years ago they were in League One. Now they're getting ready to play in the UEFA Europa League.
This year, the Saudi Pro League, I think, has been the second highest spender behind the Premier League in world football. I mean, that's a real statement. That's a real challenge to us. But at the same time, it's also an opportunity because places that are vacated across the Premier League by players moving to other countries gives us an opportunity to bring those academy players through, develop them faster, and bring players from some of the lower leagues through as well.
Despite the millions being spent by Saudi Arabia, this remains one of the most coveted trophies in football. And while the sport continues to expand overseas, the Premier League is confident English football has a bright future. Martha Fairley, News at 10, West Sussex.
Meanwhile, at the Women's World Cup, France put out World Cup first-timers Morocco. They weren't just the competitors' first Arab team. The Moroccan defender, Newhaila Benzina, became the first player to wear a hijab in a World Cup game. So whilst she may be on her way home, Newhaila has left behind quite a legacy.
A World Cup debut is always nerve-wracking, but this wasn't just Newhaila Benzina's first start here for Morocco. It's also the first time any player has worn a hijab at a major tournament. A history-making moment that's still sinking in at clubs like this one in East London.
Seeing a female footballer in a World Cup playing internationally is amazing to see, that people like me can be that great.
To see her on the pitch and you're thinking, is she wearing a hijab? That looks like me? And I think that was a really amazing moment.
Good, still listen for those whistles, well done.
Watching the young players at Brentford Football Club, it's easy to forget that the hijab was banned by FIFA until 2014, a legacy that's lingered for players like Ruqayyah until now.
I feel like we need more representation because there are lots of people saying that, oh, you can't play because you've got that on your head. But if someone's playing at world-class level, then obviously we can do it here.
Benzina not taking any chances.
In fact, the only country where the hijab remains outlawed on the pitch is France, rather fittingly, the side Morocco faced today.
It really makes no sense. I can't see any issues causing barriers and issues, dangers or anything for them to ban it. So hopefully the world can see and, everyone will say to France, what you're doing.
It is certainly no barrier here, where Yasmin coaches over 100 girls a week. Now, she'd just like to see a hijab-wearing player amongst England's lionesses.
Things take time, it's not going to happen overnight. But for the next generation, I think they're going to start dreaming, they're going to start having aspirations, and, anything's possible.
Benzina there, not the way they would have liked it to end.
For this pioneer, Morocco's defeat meant no fairy tale ending. But having inspired a new generation, she's unlikely to be alone in wearing the hijab at the top level of football for long. Rachel Younger, News at 10.
Finally, there is, it seems, no truth in the notion that foxes living in towns and cities outfox their country cousins in seeking out food. If anything, they are lazier. I can see everyone watching this from the countryside saying, there, I knew it, those lazy, good-for-nothing urban types. Anyway, researchers found that urban foxes are a little bolder, but no brighter than their rural equivalents. A maxim for humankind, perhaps.
Over a 2-year period, the UK's foxes were put through their paces. Fortnightly puzzles were set, and unbeknown to them, urban and rural foxes went head-to-head.
Are we surprised by what you found?
Yeah, in some respects we were, because there's this popular cultural portrayal of what an urban fox ought to behave like, which didn't always necessarily map onto what we found.
Dr. Blake Morton from the University of Hull led the research. His team studied foxes in 104 locations. In only 12 were the puzzles solved.
Did you find a distinction between foxes in different areas?
Yes, absolutely. So southern England, from our study, seems to be an interesting area in terms of the bolder problem-solving foxes. If you were a problem solver, it looked like there was a little greater tendency for them to come from London. So we're still.
Why is that?
Well, it's the biggest city, so I think there might be. I mean, there's just a lot of people. There's very dynamic. There's probably quite a lot of free food out there.
Foxes are known for their ability to adapt to their environment. What this study shows is that they'll work as hard as their surroundings demand.
Scientists concluded that urban foxes like food, but don't like the effort. Not the experience of people we found in Yorkshire.
They're just obsessed with food. I think that is just the key thing. They don't really go for safety, but they're just obsessed with food, going in bins, stuff like that.
And do they persist or do they give up?
No, persist.
What's your experience of foxes?
I used to live down the road and they would have been urban foxes rather than rural foxes, and they would have ripped the bins to pieces. They never gave up.
I'm from the Highlands of Scotland, so I'm not really used to urban foxes. They rummaged through our bins, managed to get into our bins, and there was litter all over the street. So I think they're quite persistent in trying to find food in urban areas.
As global urbanisation continues, scientists say studies like this are vital to ensure we avoid conflict with wildlife. It seems the cunning fox could have grasped when to work for their food and when to not. Rachel Townsend, News at 10.
The very, very crucial story of the urban versus the rural fox. In much more important news tonight, our headline, that leak of PSNI names causing great consternation in Northern Ireland. That's it from us. Good night. Thank you for watching.